you so much. It's a pleasure to be had. And among the other wonderful things you said about me, most of which were true, I note that you did not say that I was a political scientist, nor an historian, critic, or anything else dealing with contemporary culture. However, I am a Jew living in the world, and very much in the world. And this week's presentation is, of course, very, very apropos to where we stand or sit. Me on the Upper West Side. I'm at my mom's home today for this broadcast, and you in Tel Aviv. Or Jerusalem. Where are you? Tel Aviv. You're in Tel Aviv.
I am in Tel Aviv, and I do want to say that I read what you give us, so you need to give me an updated bio.
Oh, okay. No, you did great. No. I just, that was a joke. Sorry. I should realize that the introducer might be sensitive. Everything she said was absolutely true. And so that's one caveat, that I'm not a political scientist, and I could tell you what my politics are, and maybe I will if somebody really wants to know. But the other thing I need to get straight as something that I am, which is a sort of scholar of religions and religious culture, is a word that it could be misconstrued or misunderstood, and that word is myth. Myth, M-Y-T-H. Usually when we say that's a myth, what we mean is that's not true, right? But in religion, when we speak of myth, we speak about the truths, the things that go to the very depth of religion. And in fact, G.K. Chesterton, famous Catholic, very conservative, actually, journalist, once said, "Our myths are the truest things we have." Our myths are the truest things we have. So can I say for a certainty that there was a guy named Jacob who had 12 sons and a daughter, right? And these were their names, etc., according to what the Torah says. Well, when I have my Torah hat on, of course, Torah hat, I can say that. But as an historian, I can't prove that, obviously, because there's no historical proof for that. But can I guarantee you 100% that if somebody has 13 children and favors one of them especially, it's not going to end well? Yes, right? So that's what myth is. Myth is the essence of a story, right? The essence of a story with some reference perhaps to history, but improbable. That is, we can't probe the history because we can't go back that far. We don't have the evidence, etc. But it's very, very deep into people's consciousness. And conscience, and we'll talk about that. So today I want to talk about a land of stones and stories, the impossible, essential place of the land in Judaism. And I want to try to navigate the tangible and the mythic in a people's claim to home. So my thesis, as I always try to state at the beginning, is that the Jewish connection to the land of Israel is unique and multi-layered. It's a concept that operates on three simultaneous, or if you're British, simultaneous levels. The mythopoetic, that is land as sacred narrative. The legal/halachic, that is land as religious obligation. And the modern/political, that is land as national home. And there is, of course, if you haven't noticed, a modern conflict over the land that arises, in fact, from the collision of these ancient, deep-time Jewish frameworks with contemporary sort of understandings of indigeneity and belonging and home and homeland. So I want to talk, to begin with, about the impossible question. And the question is, what does it mean to belong to a land? Right? Not to say that a land belongs to you, but to belong to the land, not just to hold a deed or a passport, but for your people's deepest stories to be etched into the very geography of a land, right? So imagine, right, a Jew from Brooklyn visiting the Kotel HaMaravi, the Western Wall, for the first time. They've never been there, and yet they feel tears of joy, sorrow, connection. Why? Well, they're not weeping for land. They're not weeping for a piece of stone. They're weeping for a story, the binding of Isaac on Mount Moriah, the temple, right? 2 millennia of history with this place, prayers uttered in its direction, right? The land is a physical text. And it works in both directions. You know, my Zayda, my grandfather, Alav Hashalom, was a very pious person, and it wasn't until very late that he ever went to Israel. And it's not because he was anti-Zionist. He was a fervent Zionist. He just was uncomfortable with the fact that he knew that the reality of the state of Israel was not the reality of his religious, mythic Eretz Israel, right? So Herzl's having allegedly said what we need in a Jewish state is Jewish prostitutes and a Jewish police force to arrest them, right? Was not my Zayda's thing. He didn't want to see, you know, women with short shorts walking around Eretz Israel. Not that they defile the land in any real way, but they were pogea. They sort of poked his view of what Israel was, and he eventually went and he loved it, and you know, but it was, you know, to him the idea that there could be a secular culture in Israel, him coming from a Hasidic background, it was disjunctive. So there are ways in which you love the land and you've never been there, and when you get there, you feel this connection. And there are ways in which you love the land and therefore you don't want to be there, right? It's the extremes, of course, of what certain ultra-Orthodox groups like Neturei Karta, which is catch-all for a variety of anti-state, pro-land, ultra-Orthodox people might believe. So there's a central paradox, of course. In today's world, the Jewish claim to indigeneity, that is, we've always been in that land, occupies an impossible space. In some senses, the Jewish connection, when we talk to progressive people around us, is deemed to be too ancient to be credible. It's biblical romance, right? You know, on the other hand, right? You know, it's the modern presence is deemed to be too recent to be legitimate. What do I mean by this? So, you know, in many ways, I'm a liberal kind of. I would say I use the term progressive, although the term progressive, in my opinion, has been hijacked in recent years. But you know, I'm a liberal person who believes in all those good liberal values and many of those progressive values. I may weigh them and prioritize them differently. And so, you know, I want to talk to people like me sometimes. So when I talk to them, and if they have different opinions about the question of Zionism, right? So I say, well, you know, our people have been in that land 3,000, 4,000, maybe 5,000 years. They've been there. And they smile indulgently and they say, well, you know, that's so old. It's a myth, right? By which they mean it's not true because it's too old to be true. You can't prove that necessarily, right? You can prove archaeological presence of Jews in many, and Israelites in many different strata, but, you know, exact dating, all of that, right? So it's a myth, right? And yet those same people, if an Aboriginal American, Native American, an Indian would come and say, our people have lived on this land, you know, that you call the United States of America, and we call, since it was called Turtle Island, those very same people would be falling over themselves to applaud. Oh, isn't that wonderful? Isn't it myth? They have this ancient myth. It's so compelling. It's so beautiful. It's been here so long, right? So my myth is mythic in a false way and too old. And a different person with a different identity configuration, their myth is laudable and magical and creative and moving and spiritual and therefore true. Okay, so then I switch gears. I say, well, you know, I have relatives who've lived in Haifa now for it's going to maybe be almost 4 generations, 3 generations, right? And those same people smile at me indulgently and they say, well, the Palestinians, you know, have been in what you call the land of Israel for 6, 7 generations, right? True or not true, you know, are there Jews who've been there 6, 7 generations? I'm not even getting into that. The point is, my relatives claim that my great-grandfather was born in Haifa, right? Is deemed to be too recent to be valid. So the ancient evidence or the ancient myth is too ancient to be credible. The modern presence is too recent to be legitimate. And yet those same people, if I said to them, there's a wonderful woman from Oaxaca in Mexico who comes every couple of weeks to our house and she cleans, and she's great. She's very helpful, and but now because of some irregularities, or maybe even not because of irregularities, she's been threatened by ICE with deportation. I mean, she's been with us for a year. She pays taxes. Her kids go to the local schools. Her daughter is like a valedictorian, a salutarian. And you know what those same people will say that my family has not been in Haifa long enough will say to me about this person. They'll say, but she's been there a whole year. She's been there a whole year, right? So which is it, right? Are we too ancient in that land to be credible, or too recent to be legitimate? And if both are true, then we're caught in a trap, seen simultaneously as anachronism and intruder. So obviously, I'm not going to solve politics in this hour, but instead, I want to explore three profound layers of connection that make this conversation so fraught, and yet at the same time so essential. Act one, the mythopoetic layer, the land as sacred character. So what we need to realize in biblical and rabbinic tradition, that the land is not a backdrop, it's a protagonist. It's a character in the narrative. The biblical narrative isn't just set in Canaan, in Canaan. The land itself is an actor with moral agency. It vomits out its inhabitants. In Leviticus 18, I think it's verse 28, you can check me, right? It vomits out inhabitants for its sins. It observes the land, observes sabbatical years of rest, right? The land of Israel, of course, is considered to be the umphomos, the spiritual center of the world. You saw the belly button of the world in Greece, right? But the belly button of the world, the Tabor Haaretz, is considered by Jews and some Christians to be in Jerusalem, right? It's the place from which the rabbis tell us creation began, and the whole earth developed, as they said 2,000 years ago, like a fetus from its navel point, right? So it's not just a country, it's the nexus of divine human interaction in the world as we know it, in this myth. And, in that sense, geography is theology. Hebron, the burial place of the patriarchs and matriarchs, most of them, right, is the literal ground where the family story begins. Beit El, where Jacob dreams of a stairway to heaven, right, and says, Lokim Zeh, right? This is none other than the house of God and the gateway to heaven, right? Jerusalem, not just a political capital, but the navel of the world, as I say, the site of the temple's Holy of Holies, the place in which divine communication is effected with the world. So when religious Jews pray 3 times a day, they don't just pray east, facing east. That would be an incorrect statement. Say Jews face east when they pray. They face east toward Jerusalem. And so if you're in Jerusalem, you have to face the Temple Mount, even if that's west of where you are, right? And if you're on the Temple Mount, you have to face the Holy of Holies. Right? So this creates a spiritual and physical orientation to a specific tiny piece of land, no matter where in the world you are. It's a level of geographic intimacy woven into daily ritual. So, it's very rich. It's not something that you could just sort of extract. For a long time, I used to say, well, I'm a diasporist. I'm into Doigkeit, being here-ness, which is fine. I am, actually. I'm not planning to pick up and make Aliyah. I'm not, the events of the past couple of years have, of course, heightened and sharpened the connections of Jews either for or against or simply emotionally with the state of Israel because of what's gone on. But, you talked about Italy, Sherelle. There's a merchant from Siena in the 1600s who writes, Siena is my Jerusalem. Right? So I'm not abashed or ashamed to say that, well, I have an emotional connection with Israel, and I'm concerned about Israeli politics, and I care deeply for the people who live in Israel. I'm not going there. And, you know, as far as I'm concerned, I have many centers of my religious consciousness, right? But that's not the standard in the literature, the Bible, the rabbis, right? It all points intentionally. The whole book of Deuteronomy is sort of retooled to point to a makom asher yivchar, the place that God shall choose, and to center the land of Israel, and to foreground Jerusalem, and to highlight the temple. That's all going on. And any other sense that Jews are an international people, right, is really a response to the fact that they couldn't be in their land. You know, it's interesting when I talk to my progressive colleagues, they talk about almost every group of people on the planet that has some kind of diaspora, right? That is not a diaspora by choice, right? They call those people refugees, and that's correct. That's what we should call them. They're refugees. They're seeking refuge in another place, having been cast out of their own place. But my colleagues call Jews cosmopolitans. You see, it's like we're here on the Upper West Side because we want to be, right? Because we enjoy, and we should be joyful about our Doyekheit and our cosmopolitanism. Well, it's true for some Jews, but there are Jews also who are refugees, thousands and thousands who are refugees, hundreds of thousands, maybe at different points at different times. So it's a complicated story. First layer of Act 2, the legal halachic layer, is the land as a commanded obligation. There is a covenant in the Bible, which isn't just a story, right? It's actually, in the Bible's parlance and for the rabbis, a legal mandate. It's the foundation of a binding covenant that includes a specific territory. This is unique among ancient covenants. When the Israelites start acting up and God criticizes them through the prophet Amos, I believe it's Amos, God says to them, what do you think you're so special? You think you're so special because I took you out of Egypt? I took the Philistines out of Kaftor, and I took the Ethiopians out of wherever the hell I took the Ethiopians out of, right? You know, so don't get so arrogant with me. Don't think that I'm always going to have this relationship with you. Aha. But Amos and God are kind of cludging it there because there is something unique. There is an Abrahamic covenant that involves specific territory. A covenant means a contractual obligation entered in by two parties, willing parties, where the active party, in this case God, says to the party that accepts the covenant, we're going to have a deal together. And in this case, the deal is this: you will get my attention in a particular way, a special way. Other people will have my attention, peoples will have my attention in their ways, but you will have a special, specific way that you have my attention. And you will have a land of your own. However, that is conditional upon your behavior. My love for you is unconditional. Your relationship with the land, the gift I give you, is conditional and contingent. It's like saying, you know, look, I'm your dad, I'm your mom, I'll always love you, right? But I'm writing a will, and you will only inherit if you carry on the values that I would like you to carry on. If you don't inherit, it doesn't mean I don't love you, but you will miss out on something. Fun fact, hundreds of the 613 commandments of the Torah are tied directly to the land of Israel. Agricultural laws, tithes for the poor, priestly gifts, they can only be performed there. So the frommest person, the most religious, as you call it, because I know people who are religious and not observant, and people who are observant and not religious, right? But you say religious, fine, we'll accept that. The most religious person you know can't fulfill all 613 commandments. First of all, some are contingent on women and not on men. So if you're one and not the other, you can't do it, right? Second of all, some are contingent upon particular times, right? If you live at a time where there's the temple stands, you can do certain things, but when the temple is destroyed, you can't, right? And some, quite a few, depend on living in the land. And if you don't live in the land, you can't perform them. So one of the rationales among religiously observant people for living in the land of Israel, even when there's a dispute over whether Aliyah is a mitzvah, whether you must go live in the land of Israel, or it's a strong suggestion, right? Even the people who say it's a strong suggestion say, well, here in Israel, you can fulfill many more of the mitzvot. The only place where a full Jewish life, as biblically prescribed, is possible, right? So to sort of reiterate, the covenant grants access but does not guarantee permanence. It's a continually reevaluated contract, re-earned through behavior toward the land and fellow humans. And exile becomes not just an arbitrary fact of history because the stronger depredate the weaker, and neither is an arbitrary punishment by God, but it is the predictable result of failed stewardship and failed ethics, and it requires a portable homeland of text until stewardship of the land is again possible. So what do I mean by the conditional land? The Torah never grants permanent, unconditional title to the land of Israel. The land is not owned, but held in trust. In Leviticus 25:23, it says, the land is mine, says God. You are but strangers and settlers with me, right? This frames the covenant as conditional stewardship rather than landlordship or proprietorship. And it begs the question, if we are strangers and settlers with God, and we would like God to behave toward us with compassion and mercy and love and neighborliness, therefore it is obligatory on us to behave the same way with those who are strangers and settlers in the land that God gives us, to pass it on, so to speak. Now, the second paragraph of the Shema, Deuteronomy 11, verses 13 to 21, V'haya'im shemo tishma'u el mitzvosai asher anochi mitzavezchem hayom. It shall come to pass if you observe the commandments that I command to you this day. It's not very much in favor. Actually, in some liberal prayer books, it's excised. It's taken out. Because what it says is, if you observe the commandments, the rain will fall. Well and good, right? And if you don't observe the commandments, right, you will perish from the land that God is giving you. It sounds like magic. It sounds like, I don't know, like religious fanaticism to believe that the weather is controlled by whether I'm wearing a garment of wool and linen. But of course, that's silly. When it says, V'haya'im shamoa tishmoa el mitzvosai, my commandments, what it's talking about is a very logical point. It stresses that we do not need to rely on supernatural intervention. If we are faithful to the mitzvot that demand that we steward the land and we shepherd her resources effectively and well, then we're not going to cause environmental conditions of pollution, of resource scarcity, right? That will cause global warming. That will cause drought. That will cause water scarcity, right? Rain will fall and it will be enough. Crops will flourish. We will continue to live long on the land. But if we neglect our stewardship responsibilities toward the land, and we treat the land as something we can ride, literally roughshod over, right? Then we neglect the land, and our neglect will lead to drought, famine, and exile, because we will then begin fighting with our neighbors over resources. Somebody may say, this is crazy. We can't have these kinds of fights, and intervene from outside. We may be conquered on our land. We may be exiled, all as a result of the fact that we did not shepherd our resources effectively and with respect and love and care, and we did not acquit our moral responsibility toward the strangers and settlers with us, just as we expect that God will acquit God's moral responsibility toward us. Read through a rational, non-miraculous lens, this text, which I read every day, and I say it aloud just as I say the first paragraph of the Shema aloud, because it's very important, the text describes a social / ecological system, the abandonment of the mitzvot that govern agriculture, labor, fairness, human responsibility leads to environmental degradation, the breakdown of trust, internal conflict, and eventually displacement, because people are going to say, you didn't take care of this, we're swooping in from outside. Or they'll say, ha, this place has such resources, and yet look what a terrible job they did of it. Let's swoop in from outside and take it from them. Right? Now, the core mitzvot implicated in this include Shemitah, letting the land rest, because overworking strips soil health and accelerates erosion. Pe'ah and leket, tithes for the poor, right? Because if you neglect giving a part of your bounty to the poor among you, it undermines social cohesion and accelerates the erosion of these relationships. And it produces class antagonism. Honest weights and measures, corruption, destabilizes markets and fuels resentments, right? You think when somebody in the Israeli government is caught for skimming the top of something that's strictly a secular matter about secular Israel? No, right? There are laws about this. Prohibitions about harming the stranger, the widow, the orphan, even how one treats enemies in one's own midst. Disregard of these creates vulnerable populations with reason to revolt, reason to hate you, reason to want to slit your throat in the marketplace. There are restrictions on warfare and mandates about how one should treat enemies. If you have contempt for your neighbors and the people who live among us, I would say, it will precipitate conflict cycles. And the Shema's logic mirrors this. If you heed, I will give rain in its season. In a rational frame, if ethical norms that govern land use and social relations are upheld, the ecosystem remains stable. But if your heart turns astray, the heavens will be closed. In a rational frame, degradation and mismanagement reduce rainfall, destroy arable land, introduce toxins, produce displacement. You shall perish swiftly from the land. In a rational frame, ecological collapse and social conflict force migration or make continued presence untenable. Let me tell you something, folks. I am a rational person. I am a Maimonidean rationalist. I may teach a course on Kabbalah, and I do, but I'm a Maimonidean rationalist. And if the second paragraph of the Shema did not make sense to me in the way that I explained to you it makes sense, I wouldn't be doing this Jewish thing. I'd find something else to do. I'm doing this because it accords with what I know of the world. And it speaks against a landlord theology. It is a covenantal model that treats Israelite presence as conditional on conduct. The land, as we said, vomits out its inhabitants who defile it, though not through supernatural intervention, but through the predictable effects of exploitation, pollution, cruelty, and corruption on the viability of settled life. In this frame, the Shema becomes a very early environmental ethics. Contempt for the environment produces poisoned water, barren fields, and untenable cities. Contempt for neighbors produces conflict. Together, these ensure loss of the land long before any invading army arrives. Let's talk about what the rabbis did with these theologies. After the destruction of the temple, the rabbis, those people who had been living sort of, I like to think of it, the dinosaurs are plodding around on Earth, and then there's these little tiny mammals. Maybe it's not good to compare, the rabbis to rats and opossums, right? But they're these mammals, and they've been living there and, scooching through the legs of the dinosaurs as they lumbered along. And when the dinosaurs perish, the Earth belongs to these mammals, and they develop, right? They've been developing all along alongside the dinosaurs, right? But they've kept a low profile because with a dinosaur, you can only keep a low profile, right? The temple stands, there are sacrifices, there's this whole glorious sort of culture centered around that. But there are people who are learning texts, who are preparing for the day, right, that the temple won't be no longer. And they're called the rabbis, the masters, the teachers. And they had a question: how do you practice a land-based religion in exile from the land? I told you, so many commandments involve the land. So their solution was brilliant. They built a portable homeland through text and law. The Talmud became a surrogate for the temple. Shabbat became, the Shabbat became a temple in time, as Heschel puts it. Our Shabbat table is our altar. But you see, the difference between the rabbis and some contemporary Jews who are like, I'm done with Israel. I don't like the actions of the state of Israel. It was conceived in sin. It's criminal. It's terrible. War crimes, genocide, whatever they say, right? I'm getting rid of it. I don't need that. I can be a diaspora Jew and celebrate my Judaism in diaspora. The rabbis, by contrast, never forgot the real land. Prayers for rain were calibrated for Israel's climate, not Babylonia's. The calendar was fixed to its seasons. The hope for return was codified into the liturgy, right? When at the end of every Passover Seder and Yom Kippur service and putting away the Sukkah, Jews proclaim L'Shana Haba'ah B'Yerushalayim, which doesn't mean next year in Jerusalem. It means within the coming year, may we be in Jerusalem. There's more urgency to it. It's not a tourist slogan. It's a theological and national aspiration repeated for 2,000 years. So the rabbis managed to create a balance between the political realities of living in exile and the aspirational mythology of having a land, and also the tremendous guilt at having lost the land, right? What did it mean? How could it have happened? Now, in the modern political layer, what one sees is not a sort of confluence of deep time and linear time, as one sees among the rabbis. Myth, right? There's myth about the land of Israel. It is a real place. We're not in it, but we have now to cope with the fact that we're in Babylonia or France or Yemen or wherever we ended up, right? And what is our relationship? In the modern political layer, we have not sort of an uneasy balance or relationship, but a collision. In Zionism, we have a recalibration. Zionism was many things, and there are many Zionisms. Just so you know, at Vassar, I teach a class on really an introduction to Judaism, and it is not called Judaism. It is called Judaisms with a capital S on the end. And my wife Agi, who's a specialist in Talmud and rabbinics, and herself an Orthodox rabbi, teaches a class on Zionisms, also with a capital S at the end, right? So the various Zionisms were in part attempts to translate this deep mythic connection into the modern language of political self-determination. And it's a little kludgy. It's not smooth. This was, of course, a response to the failure of emancipation and the rise of violent European nationalism. And the paradox is, of course, this is where the too ancient, too recent bind begins to tighten. And this is why Zionism is an uncomfortable political philosophy. It's trying to do more than one thing, as many political philosophies do, but it's trying also to do things that are inimical to each other, right? You know, so for Zionists, when Zionists speak of a 3,000-year-old connection, it's dismissed as pre-modern myth. So the deep time, cyclical time of scripture is not recognized as a valid deed in the court of modern opinion, because you have to have a deed, right? This is modernity, right? And then you have two recent, when we point to the modern state built by generations of Sabras, it's dismissed because others were also living there. So the linear chronological clock of modern history is started at a point that excludes the Jewish narrative of return sometimes. And this, as I say, is very uncomfortable. The problem, I think, is that we are in an indigeneity trap. The politics of indigeneity today is obsessed with what I could call priorness, right? Whoever was there before, right? But this logic is applied inconsistently. So for some, mythic geography is honored as sacred truth. For others, for Jews, for instance, mythic geography is dismissed as biblical romance. Right? And the same as I said at the very beginning, 3 generations is not enough, right? But the same moral voices who say that 3 generations is not enough would never advocate for deporting someone who has built a life in a new country after 1 or 2 or even 3 years, right? So the goalpost for being native, I would say, moves particularly and uniquely for Jews. And this has become deeply uncomfortable for me. I'm not capable of assimilating it. You know, it doesn't make sense to me why these choices. Now, this doesn't invalidate other claims or history, right? It highlights the impossible exclusive standard often applied to Jews. And I just want to highlight that has become an issue. Now, I've been in the room, most recently a couple of weeks ago in a lecture here, you know, with people, sometimes tokenized Israelis and Jews, who really represent a position where they say we have to completely reject the state of Israel, renounce our citizenship. Everybody, all the Jews in Israel should somehow go someplace else, or if they stay, it's a contingency, Monty, because I'm not an archaeologist and I'm not talking about archaeological evidence. I'm talking about theology and philosophy, which is what I do, right? There are other people who do that. You know, these people say, well, they should just get out of there, right? It's not theirs. They should get out of there. And moreover, they should excise from their own texts. Jews need to unlearn their own texts. So texts about Amalek, the destruction, supposedly, of this nation, supposedly, that's incumbent upon Jews, or texts that position Jews as landlords over others. Well, I'm sorry, but I have been educated in traditional Jewish contexts for 55 years. And starting in 3rd grade, I heard, right, that the land is God's, the land belongs to God, and we serve on the land at God's pleasure, and we have responsibilities, and we must acquit our responsibilities in good faith with others who live on the land. So people who are discovering this for the first time and claiming we need to just rip out pages of tradition because they don't suit their particular politics, progressive politics, are, I think, misguided. They have a wrong-headed approach. What we have to say is, let's look. So the Torah talks about a nation that existed at the time that the Israelites came out of Egypt, called Amalek, that waylaid the Israelites and attempted to genocide them and murder them, starting with the weak. And we are enjoying to wipe out the memory of Amalek, right? So very early in the tradition, a number of responses emerged, right? One response, Amalek doesn't exist anymore. It was a one-time thing. That was a particular nation, and this was a particular war with them. And just as they tried to destroy us, we need to destroy them completely, because if one of them is left, then it's going to be bad for the Jews. You know, the legend is that Agag, the king of Amalek, was saved by King Saul. Saul said, well, you're a king, I'm a king, you know, hang out. And he said, I'll give you a life sentence. I won't kill you. So he's in jail for the night. And King Saul says, you're a king, I'm a king. what would you like? Doritos? Would you want a beer? He says, no, I want a woman. Haven't had a woman in a while. Okay. Saul brings him a woman. They, as the kids today say, they get with each other, right? And then Shmuel comes, the prophet comes, and of course he kills the king of the Amalekites, but not before the king of the Amalekites has impregnated someone. And her great, 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 great descendant is who? Haman ben Hamedata Agagi, the Agagites, right? From the family of Agag, who is Sorer HaYudim, who's the one who wants to genocide all the Jews. So the rabbi said, get rid of that nation, get rid of that tribe. But they don't exist anymore. So the commandment is not a commandment that continues to exist. Other people said, it says get rid of the memory of Amalek. So what does that mean, right? How do we interpret that? It's not a physical commandment. There are many, many commandments in the Torah. For instance, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, that are interpreted by the rabbis in ways that they could live with and we could live with. The cost of an eye. Somebody loses an eye. How much does it cost to heal that person? How much does it cost to bring them back up to speed? How much does the person lose because of their embarrassment or shame? How much does it cost in continual care for the rest of their life, right? The price of an eye, but not the price of a life for an eye, right? And so these are important ideas that constantly are getting retooled. So the idea that we should now expunge from our traditions, right, any reference to the land or to the special relationship of the Israelites to the land seems to be ludicrous. There are different ways to do it, and it's been being done for almost as long as the texts have existed. So what do we have comparatively among Jews and others with regard to the land? Historically, for much of Christian history, the Holy Land was a site of pilgrimage and prophecy, but the true Israel was the spiritual church. Judaism remained stubbornly physical in its attachment to the land, according to Christians, yet further evidence of the fact that Jews were literalists and not spiritual at all. In more recent years, for various reasons, evangelical Christianity has gotten on the Zionism bandwagon. And many people argue that is a moving a mover and shaker in Zionism generally is the support of evangelical Christians, although that may be changing again. As you see, the growing impatience among right-wing evangelical Christians in America with the state of Israel and its actions over Gaza. So we don't know. The jury's out. What about Islam? Well, in Islam, Jerusalem, Al-Quds, is the third holiest site. It was the destination of Muhammad's Miraj, his night journey. The land is sacred, but it's not the exclusive geographic center of Islamic law and practice in the way that it is for Judaism. In fact, if Muslims refer to the platform that Herod built to expand the Temple Mount, that we call the Har HaBayit, the mountain of the house of the Lord. They call it Haram Sharif, the beautiful or noble sanctuary. But there's also another name for it, which is Beit al-Maqdis, right? Which is Beit HaMikdash. They acknowledge that this was the Jewish temple site. So Christians, they're not, attached to that land the way Jews are, in a different way. Muslims, no. There's certainly many Christian and Muslim Palestinians who are attached to the land because it's been their home for generations. That's pretty good. It's not a bad thing. I'm just talking about the text. And one shouldn't say, well, because it has greater weight in the Jewish text, then it obviously belongs more to the Jews than people who inhabit it. There's no basis for that. And then, of course, there's the internal and eternal Jewish debate, the ultra-Orthodox Neturei Karta, opposing the state of Israel on theological grounds, believing that only the Messiah, the Mashiach, can restore Jewish sovereignty. And this highlights the ongoing vibrant tension within Judaism about how to manifest the relationship with the land. So I see we have 10 minutes. Let me just recap, and then we can have some questions. We've seen the land as sacred story, legal obligation or not, right? The debate, and modern paradox. To reduce it only to one is to misunderstand it completely. We need to acknowledge all the layers of meaning. A truly mature understanding of this land must also make space for the layers of meaning, attachment, and the tragedy that it has that has unfolded on that land for Jews and others, Palestinians in particular, right? The love of Palestinians for the land is also real. Their pain is also profound. The land itself is layered with competing stories of belonging. The Jewish connection to the land of Israel is not a simple real estate claim. It's not a real estate claim at all. It's a complex, ancient, and enduring relationship between a people and a place that has shaped their identity, their law, their soul, their liturgy for millennia. To engage with this conflict honestly, we must first understand that for Jews, this land was and is and never was, I'm sorry, and is and never just a land. It's a central character in the Jewish story. This challenge is immense. It's human, it's political, it's moral, it's legal, right? And it's also central to other people's stories as well. And the future depends on finding a way to honor all these sets of stories without erasing any of them. And it's our duty as Jews to be able to mediate that for ourselves and to hope that we can find an interlocutor and a partner who is willing to discuss in good faith what that might mean for us, them, our relationship, and all of our relationships to this land. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to jump into questions and start a little bit with history and then some questions that came up more contemporary. One was about like the shift within liturgy with the reform movement towards the relationship to the land.
Sure. So the various reforming movements had various different takes. Remember, the first reform movement was called Hasidism, right? This was a huge spiritual reform that involved, just as the German reform movement a little bit later, that involved a liturgical reform also. So the Hasidim took on a nosach, a prayer form that was a nosach of Eretz Israel, the nosach of the Ari, of Isaac Luria, who was a Jew who lived in the land of Israel. And there are certain aspects of Hasidic prayer that, that differ about in wording in various ways, and the Hasidim developed a particular relationship with the land. Some were against state, a state before the Messiah. Some viewed it in a spiritual way. Then what you're talking about, I think, the interlocutor, is the German reform movement that really emphasized the principle of what later Yiddish speakers, although never German Jews who spoke a strict German, right, would call Deutschkeit, being here. And there was an expunging of references to the land of Israel, among other things, by the way, like the resurrection of the dead, from the liturgy, in this case, because there was a fear about accusations of dual loyalty. So liturgy does respond, even Orthodox liturgy, responds to the tides and currents in politics.
Thank you. Another question was about the kind of relationship to the land, and is there any parallel to draw about the relationship within Judaism to prophecy, which has kind of passed from our time, and can that be shaken within Jewish practice?
So is the suggestion that just as we no longer have active prophecy, we should now remove the idea of the land of Israel from the ambit of our religious consciousness? I think it's not a very good parallel. We also don't have a temple, right? But we talk about the temple, and the temple is rethought. And some people believe that the temple will literally be rebuilt. Some people believe it as a spiritual thing. People find it useful, right? Now, the land is a different matter because the land still exists, you see, and we still have a relationship to it. So I don't really see the parallel, but it was a good try. Nice stab.
Another question. Now, most of the other questions are around more contemporary issues. So there are many. I'll pick a couple. So one was, if someone would say to you, Jews are settler colonialist, what would be your 3-sentence answer? I'll allow you even 5.
Right. So a refugee can't really be a settler colonialist. So I think that, the foundation of the state of Israel really was a refugee state. Secondly, settler colonialism is not mandated by international government or international bodies like the UN. Thirdly, settler colonialism means you live elsewhere, you send your colonists someplace else, and they send you back. They export things. So unless we think that Jews are sort of ruled from the Upper West Side, and where we control the entirety of the state of Israel as our colony in order to produce minimally falafel, but probably falafel with lafa, skug, and amba, then, in that case, we might be settler colonialists. But as far as I can tell, we aren't. But, settler colonialist is also a designation that, like so much that is slippery today. I know I'm wearing a bow tie, so like you think of me as Bill Crystal and I'm a conservative. It's complete bullshit. I'm such a if I told you my politics, I'm a very, very liberal guy, right? It's just that these issues are bugbears for me because people who talk about them are so full of crap, right? So the settler colonialism, that term becomes a moving target. So if I define settler colonialism, as not comprising these three things, then somebody will come back and show me that actually it can comprise those things. It's like saying, there's this one scholar I won't mention, but the thesis of this person is that the covenant should be redefined to include the Palestinians. Because, covenant is just a word, right? Well, no, covenant is a covenant, and it's between, as I said, two parties, not three parties, and it obliges the one party to observe the mitzvot, right? So this person seems to know that God wants to invite the Palestinians into the covenant, and that the Palestinians will be interested in observing the mitzvah of shatnez and celebrating Shmini Atzeret, right? I mean, the whole thing is ludicrous. It's like saying I've been married for 20 years, but now we're going to bring a third person into the marriage. And yes, I know we're going to call it a marriage, but it's really going to be a marriage between three people, and it's not entirely clear that this third person is actually consenting to the marriage or that I want it, right? So, they become moving targets. Yes, Shira.
There are a lot of more questions coming in, so I'm just going to try to condense many of them into one.
Room for one and a half.
So now that you've laid out the kind of three sections of the complex relationship, would you say the Palestinians have a similar layered one, or where does it meet our relationship with the land?
I don't know much about what the Palestinians have or don't have. I just know that if we rule over a population in a land that we claim as ours, we have obligations toward the population we rule over. If the population is hostile, we have obligations also to deal with them, even though that they're hostile. If the population is friendly, we have our obligations are obligations, and I'm not in a position to elucidate their claims or to support or deny their claims. They have a right to make claims, and what I find is that my people is now in a position where they're in a position where they're governing, and a government has responsibilities. Just like Hamas in Gaza is not just a terrorist organization; it's a government, and as a government, it has responsibilities, right? So every government has responsibilities toward its people, and so I can only speak. I can't even speak from the perspective of Israelis because I'm not one, right? But from the perspective of Jews, there are relational ethics that need to be in place, even if it's very, very difficult, and even if you feel, and it may be the case, that the people you're occupying, right, are hostile.
I'm going to squeeze in a half question. When you say the land, what geographical space are you referring to now?
Well, that's good. So nowadays, I can't make a statement on that because I'm not an international authority. I'm not an Israeli. I'm not setting the borders of the land of Israel for anyone. What the rabbis meant was an area that encompassed the West Bank and parts of Jordan and parts of the Sinai, right? I'm content to think of the land as whatever, a negotiation settlement between Israel, her neighbors, the international bodies, et cetera, determines the land to be, and what Israelis ultimately have to agree on is the land. This seems to be a very difficult, perhaps right now impossible prospect. So for me to make declarations of what the land is, right, I can only say this is what is described or prescribed, I should say, proscribed and prescribed for the inhabitants of the land, whatever the parameters of the land end up being. Right. So you're not going to get me to say that I think that the West Bank is an occupation or it's not an occupation. What is Gaza? What is Sinai? That's not what I'm intending to discuss here. Fair enough.
Thank you so much. I think you're definitely fulfilling Judaism, the big questions, as I see the questions streaming in. It touches, everything touches a nerve, so that's good. And thank you for kind of allowing us to engage with it from a different perspective in a different way.
I feel very privileged to be able to do that. And just again, to Monty and archaeology and does this prove, does this not prove? That's something that people who have that expertise should discuss. As you probably noted, I'm interested in certain things and good at talking about certain things, but the things in which I either have no expertise nor sometimes interest are not areas into which I venture because I feel I would be serving you poorly. So my intention is to serve you well and to see you next week when the topic is, what is the topic next week?
I will let you know. The topic is rationalism.
Okay. Well, we touched on that today, right? Where I said like this crazy second paragraph of the Shema that people are like, let's get rid of that. It's about God's supernatural actions, stopping the rain, and I think I convinced myself that it's entirely, I mean, it's entirely logical position, right? The idea of what is logical, what is rational, and what is not will be explored next week. So I look forward to that. Have a great week and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you very, very much. I will note that I'll include in the follow-up email some previous CSP programs that touch on some of the questions
Oh,
that
good. Excellent. We've
experts
had
talk about.
Yeah, we've had really good archaeologists as opposed to me,
Right.
who's not an archaeologist. Oh, by the way, I didn't wait. You said something at the beginning that was a total lie. A total lie. You said you'd sold 50% of the trip. I just sold 3 more seats. I didn't even tell Ari about that. So people better get on this. If you want to come to Italy with me, I don't go to Italy every day. Why should I? I have the Upper West Side. I have Poughkeepsie, for God's sake. Why should I go to Italy? And moreover, why with you, Harris and Jan? I mean, so please do sign up already, okay? And I love you all, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.